So, over the weekend, I was listening to an episode of Radiolab where they got to talking about jury nullification, and I was familiar with the phenomenon of jury nullification. Juries are given fairly unchecked authority to reach any verdict that they want for any reason that they want. There are limits on the process. You can be dismissed from a jury, or a mistrial can be declared if you consulted outside news sources, if you looked up the law on the internet, if a juror reports that during deliberation you did certain things on a very short list of juror misconduct. But absent those, and those are all about the process, your outcome, the way you decide to find someone guilty or not guilty, that's not really subject to review except in a very limited set of circumstances, which means that a jury can decide, yes, this person violated all of the elements of the law, but the law itself is unjust, and therefore we're going to refuse to convict as a way of operating as the conscience of the community and saying, even if this is the law, we reject the law. Now, that can happen, and when people hear about it, a lot of times they get very romantic notions because people sometimes feel as though certain laws shouldn't exist, but they're helpless. They don't know what to do about these unjust laws, and then jury nullification just sounds like a drink of cool, fresh water to someone dying of thirst in the desert because, wow, I can be powerful against this injustice. I can make injustice turn into a good, positive, acceptable outcome. But what they forget is jury nullification goes both ways, and so it is the case that back around the years leading up to the Civil War, there were some people who helped runaway slaves escape, and there were juries that refused to convict them, and that was jury nullification, and how wonderful. But then jump ahead, 50, 75, 100 years, and you had a lot of white people committing crimes of violence, rape and murder and lynchings against African Americans in the Deep South, and juries refusing to convict them. And that was jury nullification. And there are a lot of different social institutions that have that kind of problem. I come from a part of the country where they are very big on how the government should not stop public displays of religion. So there ought to be orchestrated prayer, organized prayer at things like high school football games. But when they want that kind of religious expression protected and allowed in public, they don't want it for other religions. And they definitely would not want anyone being led in a Hail Mary, or in Muslims praying, or in people of the Church of Satan conducting a worship service in public, because they just don't see how that logic extends. What they really want is they want their own particular kind of worship to happen, but they don't think about the process. They don't think that that logic continues. And so I think that we have a problem thinking through what it is that we want and realizing that if what we want applies not only to ourselves, but to the people with whom we don't agree. The problem right now with our loose social mesh is that it's too easy for people who exploit that loose social mesh to take the logic of what it is we think we want and to make it boomerang into something that is not at all what we had in mind. And that's a thought that, even putting it into words like that, I think I may have that thought exactly backwards. I do know that it seems as though with the loss of the continuity of our community, with the loss of our commitment, that people who live in a community with us, even if we don't agree with them, we want to live at peace with them. We want to arrive at workable compromises to where the community works. With the loss of that consensus, I think that there's been, increasingly, we are moving in the direction of a fundamental shift in an element of our culture. And I think that this is one of the currents that's kind of moving through the way we express our public concerns. And I have to say that for much of the rest of this, I'm cheating a little bit, and I've pulled something out of my lecture notes. This is a lecture I give in my intercultural communication class, because there's one particular categorization of cultures where the United States would have been put down at the end of the spectrum, but increasingly what I am seeing what I regard as a fairly radical shift is we don't belong where we would have been located anymore. We belong someplace else. And I've been talking in a lot of abstractions already in this particular episode, so let me make it a little bit more concrete. This is research that comes from a couple of intercultural researchers by the names of Fons Trompenaars and Charles Hampton Turner, and I probably mispronounced that first name terribly. The name for this particular measure or categorization of cultures it's the universalist versus particularist cultural spectrum. And so an illustration that I use when I teach this, and I borrowed this from David Livermore, you might imagine that you are a passenger in a car being driven by a very good friend of yours, and your friend is driving 20 miles over the speed limit and causes a very, very serious accident. Now, you're an eyewitness to it, so you're called to testify. And your friend's attorney says that if you can testify your friend was doing the speed limit, you will save your friend from a long prison term. What will you do? You could tell the truth. You could lie and say your friend was driving the speed limit. Or you could say you don't remember how fast your friend was going, but she's always been a safe driver. Now, that question, Trompenaars and Hampton Turner put that to managers from around the world, and in Sweden, just about all of them said they would tell the truth, and their friend should not expect them to lie. In the United States, it was about 95%. In France and Spain, about 70% said they would not lie. In India, China, and Russia, it was 50-50. And then in Korea and in Venezuela, less than 40% said that they would not lie. They said they would testify in favor of their friends because they owed it to them as friends. So the way to think about this feature of culture, this difference along which cultures can be located is, do people have an obligation to the laws and the rules, or are people obligated to one another, to the people with whom they have significant relationships? Another way, a more clear way to put it possibly, is equality and fairness more important than loyalty, or is loyalty more important than equality and fairness? In a universalist culture like Sweden, like the United States, I would have thought, the idea is the rules apply equally to everyone. But particularists believe we have obligations to people we know, that circumstances are everything, and you can't treat all situations and all people the same. Someone who was from a particularist culture might say, a speed limit of 40 miles an hour is arbitrary. That's just a number painted on a sign. But a relationship is not arbitrary. It is a real, lived, experienced bond with another person. So, am I going to be more loyal to a speed limit sign, or am I going to be more loyal to my dear friend? That's an easy choice. One other interesting twist to how this works out is there are a lot of universalists who say they might be a little bit more comfortable lying if it was only a speeding ticket, not an injury accident. If it was something piddly and really low stakes, they might tell a little white lie. But people who are from particularist cultures often report they're more likely to lie if there was a serious injury involved, because in a circumstance like that, their friend needs them more than ever. People from universalist cultures are very, very big on contracts, and they believe that a trustworthy person is one who sticks to her word. They believe there's only one reality, and a deal is a deal, and there should be only one price for any product, so they don't tend to be very big on haggling. Particularists have much looser contracts that are more easily modified, and they believe a trustworthy person is not necessarily someone who sticks to their word, but a trustworthy person is someone who has your back. They believe that every situation is different, and it is in particularist cultures that you're more likely to see haggling happen in the marketplace. Now, when I teach this, one of the things I now point out is the United States predominantly is universalist, and Trompenaars and Hampton Turner's data showed 95% of the managers they polled from the United States would say that they would not lie to protect their friend in the hypothetical that started off this whole discussion. But that communities of people of color, African Americans and people, Latino communities, people are more likely to be particularist because they don't see law enforcement as impartial and fair. They see defending their friends and family as a survival tactic, and they, as a result, are more relationship-oriented. So here, let me start to explain why this is running through my head and really has been one of the themes running through my head going all the way back to November as I tried to piece together how could I have been so surprised by how far civic life, public life in the United States seems to have strayed from how it was in the past. I remember a Saturday Night Live sketch, which it's easy to pull up on YouTube. I think I've even mentioned this a couple of times before. I really like the Black People Jeopardy that they have from time to time. Well, when Tom Hanks hosted, they had him on as a sort of dislocated white man from the South who believed in a whole lot of conspiracy theories, had lost all faith in the government, and after a couple of when he first came on as a contestant, they weren't really sure that he belonged there, but then he started answering some of the questions absolutely correctly, and they felt a strong sense of affinity. They felt a lot of recognition and maybe even the beginnings of a bond. And so when I get here to talking about how communities of people of color are more likely to be particularist, I think that the segment of the United States population that reasoned out their options in the election and became Trump supporters, I see a very, very powerful particularism. And I shouldn't limit it to them because I think this is a force, and a very troubling force, that's operating on both of the polarized wings of the political spectrum in the United States, which is to say, loyalty is far more important than fairness or equality. It feels as though fairness has gone way, way down the priority list, way, way down the hierarchy of appropriate measures. It feels as though people feel as though fighting dirty is warranted because they are, as I've talked about a bunch of times in the past, they're playing a game that is rigged. They are playing a game in which they are being manipulated, in which the assumptions of their opponents are not out in the open, and the rules are constantly being rewritten, and the rug is constantly being pulled out from under them. And one of the things that is a theme that comes out early and is reinforced frequently in the conflict class that I teach is when people behave in a way to where they don't want to work with you to try to resolve a conflict, it typically, a good first diagnosis is that they feel overpowered. They feel that you have too much power, that you are not dealing in good faith, that they are not in control of their situation, they feel out of control, and they feel cornered. And when someone feels cornered, what they're likely to do is to put up a threat display. And if the United States in the past, if you were to take this big of a sample, collect this much data from people in leadership positions and find that they had a commitment to universalism, that they had a commitment to rules are binding even when those rules don't produce a positive outcome for your own people that you feel close to, if that data made that case that powerfully in the past, but then you look today, and supporters of Donald Trump, they're confronted with things he said before and ways he's behaved since that don't match what he said, and they're not concerned. They are confronted with criticisms that he leveled against the previous president, and now he does the exact same things. The simplest example is he said that President Obama played too much golf, and he's playing much more golf than President Obama did. And people want to level that as criticism against him and call him a hypocrite. But his supporters are absolutely not concerned with that because consistency and fairness and uniformity are not values. The value at the top of the hierarchy is loyalty. And really what a lot of Trump supporters say is behind their support of Trump is that he supports them. He backs them. He's the one who's got their interests in mind. And I think there's some evidence that ought to ought to make them question that. There's some evidence that ought to make it really, really hard to stick to that assessment. But, people make their own assessments based on what they see, what they perceive, what they play up, and what's going on in their situation. And I'm not in the same situation as people who are Trump supporters, so it's not going to look the same to me. And I do have to say, you look at the language, you look at the really, really hysterical language that people who are opponents of Donald Trump are using against him, and then you go back and you look at the language that opponents of Barack Obama were using against him, and it is absolutely striking, the parallels. I mean, if you don't look at the names that people choose, the login names, you see almost the same arguments being rehearsed. And I think that people who are where I am politically, and I am not a fan of Donald Trump especially, they would say, well, the arguments may look the same, but the difference is, in our case, the evidence is not made up. The evidence is not concocted. Well, I think it's not. I find the evidence pretty compelling, and I think that one of the things that's troubling is the willingness of people to accept, based on their loyalty, they will dismiss evidence that ought to be a measure of objective reality. They'll dismiss it and say that they don't find that authoritative, that that's not persuasive at all. And really, I guess this is where my thought is going. I think that there's an old saying, I'm not going to remember who said it at the moment. It was maybe Dan Rostenkowski, but it was, you're entitled to a different opinion, but you're not entitled to your own set of facts. But I think as the universalism in the United States is dissolving, as it's weakening, as we're moving more and more toward becoming particularists, I think that we just sort of rested on this unspoken assumption that evidence was evidence was evidence. And we all had to be able to agree on what the evidence was and what the evidence said. But my own particular area of academic specialty, argumentation, I know that people in different communities regard different kinds of messages, different kinds of observable phenomena as evidence. And so there are lots of different parts of the world where people do not believe that the United States landed a man on the moon. And they have alternate explanations, and they have alternate narratives of what they think happened, and those are compelling to them and persuasive, and those establish their opinions. Whereas in the United States, we think there's documentary evidence that makes it absolutely beyond dispute that we landed a man on the moon, and therefore it's irrational to disagree. I know that there are populations in the United States, there are communities in the United States where narrative is actually the form of evidence that has the most moral force. You tell your own story, you tell your family's story, but there are other groups in the United States where telling your story really is only looking at a situation from a single limited perspective, and what you've got to do is you've got to incorporate you've got to work your way to principles that can work for everyone, that can be fair no matter whose story is being put in to the formula, no matter whose story is being filtered through or measured when the law is applied. So we talk about how this may be a post-truth political environment. We may have a crisis of authority. We may have a crisis of believing what is right in front of our eyes. But, I mean, again, I think you have to be sort of historically naive, and I think you have to have kind of a very egocentric sense of the problem that's right in front of you is worse than the problem that anyone else has faced, to believe that it's a bigger problem than it was in the past. Because you look at what was published in the days of yellow journalism, and a lot of it absolutely could not be believed. You look at the Hearst coverage of the situation in Cuba and the Philippines that made it more likely that the Spanish-American War would happen in the late 1890s. And then you look at what happens today as far as fake news and as far as writing news off as fake news, and we want to say that this is something brand new and we can't believe it's happening. Well, we only can't believe it's happening because we don't bother to study history. It's happened from time to time throughout human history. It may be that we are disturbed, disillusioned, and uncomfortable because we thought we had somehow grown beyond that. We thought we had learned that lesson and put it behind us. And I don't know, maybe this is the next episode, that there are too many lessons that we think we have learned them and we have put them behind us, and we get complacent and we get smug, and that's a really, really silly sense of security to have. So maybe we think that today, we are surrounded by so much unmistakable evidence of the benefits of science that anyone who's reasonably well educated will see that it just makes sense to get your children vaccinated, until we see a movement take shape that says, no, I have a fear of autism and I have a sense of identification with other mothers who fear autism, and we all together, we will exercise our power and we will enjoy our sense of being bonded to others by resisting the widely shared norm of vaccinating your children. And we will circulate this narrative that we actually keep our children safe and we actually oppose big pharma by not vaccinating our children. Meanwhile, onlookers who are absolutely scandalized and say, you never lived through the time of polio, obviously. You never lived through the time of whooping cough. You never saw people die or become paralyzed in excruciating pain, and then saw the blessing of the vaccines arrive that made those particular illnesses a memory, and increasingly a faint memory. And then we see that we pretty much have to learn that lesson again. And one of the things that comes up again and again when I study the Bible, one of the things that my faith teaches me is, it doesn't matter how many miracles, it doesn't matter how many wonderful signs God displays for the people he's chosen, whether that's Israel in the Old Testament or whether that's the people who came out to follow Jesus around and listen as he taught. Try that again. Listen as he taught. We learn the lesson, and the lesson fades almost instantly. I have a few times over the years taught it to a Sunday school class or a Bible study group by saying that the Israelites had the world's worst case of ADD because they could not hold on to the lesson. The miracle was never enough. Jesus actually taught a parable about Lazarus and the beggar, and Lazarus said, if you'll send this, actually Lazarus and the rich man, I'm getting all the details wrong today. The rich man said to Jesus, if you'll send Lazarus back to warn my brothers so that they don't wind up here in hell with me, then they'll be convinced by that. And Jesus said, no, they've got the law and the prophets, and if that's not enough to convince them, then they wouldn't be convinced even if someone rose from the grave. And so, where do I wind up with this? I wind up with this saying that I do think one of the battles we've got to fight again, and one of the projects that we've got to work through again, is we've got to find a way to work out some of the pathologies and some of the dysfunctions of media. We've got to find a way to bring people back to feeling confident in a common pool of reported events. And I don't know if that's about reforming institutions so much as it is about waiting for a turbulent period in history, an economically turbulent period and a culturally turbulent period, a period that is also sort of made toxic by fear of violence, even though I think that fear of violence is wildly, wildly inflated, and that's probably another episode. It could be that all of these forces are at the moment putting too much stress on what I think we never really appreciated was a fragile consensus in the first place. I think we thought for a long time that we had enough consensus about evidence, about the facts, that we had a basis for community to operate, and that we thought that that would always be the case, that that was something that we could count on in the same way that we count that the ground beneath our feet is going to hold us up right up until an earthquake happens. And a few times I have thought about this as an earthquake, that it was the tectonic forces there was so much pressure, there was so much tectonic plates, the rubbing between them built and built and built until what was keeping them separate gave way. And that is sort of how I have been thinking about where we've seen dislocations in our working, functional sense of community up until now. So I have a little timer running here, and it tells me when I get to 30 minutes, and sometimes what I try to do is I try to stretch out my wrap-up a little bit so I get to a nice even number of 30, but it's summer, and I'm a little bit less ambitious right now than I am during the school year. I think that what we don't do, we don't have any sense of we as a community. There's a wholeness to us, and there are groups that are not necessarily compatible within that whole, but we all look out for each other. Instead, I think there is a sense of distrust and a sense of endangerment that leads us to impose a lot of litmus tests on one another and to be very quick to be almost satisfied, almost relieved to be able to unleash our hostility on one another. And I see a lot of people circulating stories and jokes and liking to watch TV shows where they get to hate someone, where they get to look and see how awful somebody is, and that feels good. And in a healthy, functioning community, that it shouldn't feel good. There should be a certain measure of that, maybe, for the sake of humor, but it's almost like that's recreation. Like, you've got to send around the latest viral story of this awful person who pitched a tantrum in public, or this awful person who was clueless and inconsiderate of other people, and it's almost like there's a foodie movement for hatred, which really, really makes me want to almost stay home and nail my door shut if people that I am surrounded by, if that's what they're seeking as their own particular form of hedonism. And I think that's because the more we know who we are against, the more we feel kind of knotted together into tight little groups of who are we for, whose team are we on, and our team becomes tighter and tighter and more cohesive by being opposed to other teams. And I don't think that you can run a community on that. And some of the forces I was describing before, the economic forces and the security forces and the dysfunctions about reporting events, I mean, I guess I just have to pray and hope that those are going to ease up a little bit, and there are enough other people who want to draw these opposing teams back into our larger circle to where we all do coexist, to where you can be like crosstown rival football teams that play against one another spiritedly with the best play that you can possibly bring after hard work and practice. But you also see those other players as, in some sense, your colleagues, as in some sense the people you measure yourself against, and so you appreciate them and you respect them. And I don't know, this seems to be how I end every episode. I don't know what it's going to take for us to get back there. It may be something that's out of our hands, that we don't have a lot of control over, that really what we've got to do is some of these forces just have to work themselves out. Some of them we may have to wait for the inspiration and the invention and the ingenuity, things that we haven't foreseen and we can't control the timing of. And in some sense, some of this appreciation of hostility, this taste for hating other people, and this eagerness, this greed for power, and taking the shortcut of power, of generating power out of opposition and hostility, we just have to wait for those to run their course. It's almost like the McCarthy era and the fear of communism, the panic against communism, and how we pretty much had to just ride that out and wait for a lot of forces to ease off and a lot of people to see for themselves. If you do what you've been doing and you continue to take it to its logical extreme, this is the world you're making for yourself. And to pray that people will step back from the precipice and say, this is not the world I want to make for myself. It really does kind of alarm me how within recent memory, we were so committed to universalism, but now we have one standard that we apply to people we are loyal to, and another standard we apply to the people that we're opposed to, and these are all people who are part of our community. So I think that's probably just looking at the same phenomena, the same situation that I've been talking about in weeks past from another angle. I think when you have something that's a feature of culture, when I teach that intercultural class, I always say culture changes, but it doesn't tend to change quickly. But there are moments in which it can change quickly. September 11th made some radical changes in our culture. But you hope that sometimes the distortions of culture, the sudden and extreme changes, that things will regress back to the mean. And this is definitely one of those situations where I do hope that things will regress back to the mean. If progress regresses back to the mean, which I think is the case, then maybe regress will also regress back to the mean as well.